Well, now that some of the dust has settled around the ACORN pimp and prostitute scandal, it's given me a chance to get a handle on the vague feeling that I've had that I've somehow seen this somewhere before. You know, for the longest time, the idea was just gnawing away in the back of my head, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I did. The way that Andrew Breitbart handled the ACORN campaign reminded me very much of something that happened a little earlier in the grand scheme of things. It was back in August, on August 2nd to be exact. There's a small town in southeastern Italy, just above the heel of the Italian boot, and Andrew Breitbart's campaign reminds me very much of another campaign that was fought near this little town called Canny back in August of 216 BC, under the direction of a general named Hannibal. No, not that Hannibal. No, not him either, although, no, this Hannibal, Hannibal the Great. Canny is the model that every general prays for. You know, most battles, especially ancient battles, consisted of beating up an army and then pushing it off the battlefield. But at Canny, the outnumbered Carthaginians actually destroyed the Roman army. The Romans brought about 90,000 men to the fight, and around 50,000 of them were killed outright. It's simply the greatest victory, or the greatest defeat, depending on your perspective, in military history. Now, obviously, this battle with ACORN in the culture wars has nothing like the scale of Canny, but the strategy was so similar that it triggered the memory for me. Both Hannibal and Breitbart spent a great deal of time learning the tactics of their enemies. They both knew their opponents so well, they might as well have been commanding the opposing forces themselves. And both generals used the terrain of the battlefield to maximum extent. At Canny, Hannibal maneuvered so that the Romans would be fighting into the sun and even into the wind, so that the glare and the dust of battle would be in the Romans' eyes. Andrew Breitbart and his new website, Big Government, positioned his pieces in such a way that every move his opponents made drew them ever deeper into the trap he had set for them. The genius of Hannibal at Canny was to allow his center to fall back. The Romans had developed such a blind hatred for him that he knew that as soon as they gave ground, the Romans would charge, and they did. Hannibal continued to allow his center to fall back, and the Romans became so densely packed together that they could neither fight nor even move. Blinded by the sunlight and the dust, the Romans kept pushing forward against the retreating center of the Carthaginian line, too blinded to see that out on the flanks had not moved. And then, at the perfect moment, the center held. The flanks encircled the Romans, and Rome, which fought most of its battles with 2 legions and very rarely 3 or even 4, would lose all 8 of the legions they had mustered that day. Now, I'm reminded of Canny because Andrew Breitbart, Glenn Beck, and Fox News had the tactical brilliance to release these videos slowly, falling back all the time, knowing exactly what their opponents would do. The first video revealed ACORN workers not batting an eyelid when James O'Keefe and Hannah Giles entered their office and asked for help setting up an underage teenage brothel. Breitbart had guessed correctly that ACORN would claim that this was simply a few bad apples in one office and just throw them under the bus, which is exactly what they did. Andrew Breitbart, holding enormous reserves of evidence, let them come on and make that defense. Now, the next day, a second video surfaced showing identical treatment at Washington, D.C. Okay, 2 bad offices, said ACORN, but that's all, a few small offices with a few bad apples. And Breitbart let them come on. And then a third video in New York City. Now, New York City is not some out-of-the-way burg. Andrew knew exactly what ACORN's defense would be. He let them make the defense and then produced another devastating video to counter it. The first 3 videos showed African-American women offering tax advice and taxpayer money to help this sex slave trade that O'Keefe and Giles were peddling. Andrew waited for what he knew ACORN would do next, charge. And the charge was racism. Again, he read them like a book. Video 4 showed a white woman. Video 5 showed a Hispanic male. Every time ACORN tried to construct some kind of we're the victim defense, Andrew had a card to play that exposed them for what they were, a criminal enterprise, corrupt to the core, using the same tired excuses that have allowed them to become so corrupt in the first place. By day 2, the U.S. Census had severed ties with ACORN, and that was the win I was praying for personally, because the census controls districting and congressional representation, as well as determining where the river of federal money flows. That was all I could have hoped for. But Andrew played ACORN like a violin. Within a few more days, the Senate voted to defund ACORN. A few days after that, congressional investigations had been called for, and as I write this, the IRS has severed ties to the organization, meaning ACORN will no longer be able to give tax advice. And given what we saw in these videos, that's probably a good idea. Now, ACORN, as it currently exists, is finished. So what lessons can we learn from all of this? Well, first of all, ACORN deserved everything that they got. It has a long history of voter fraud in multiple states. And to those idiots and apologists who see nothing wrong with dead people voting, the real crime is simply that a false ballot going one way deprives a citizen of his valid vote going the other way. Dead voters steal the franchise from the living. But what gave these charges political traction that the voter fraud evidence lacked was video, pictures and sound. We live in the age of video, and one video by O'Keefe and Giles has more impact than 10,000 pages of written evidence. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. Now, here's a shocking twist. While I don't know this for certain, I suspect it's the truth. You may think that Andrew Breitbart, Glenn Beck, Fox News, and BigGovernment.com were fighting against an enemy, and the enemy was ACORN. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think the enemy they were fighting against are the media. By not covering this story, not at all, they showed that the mainstream media, we don't even call them the news media anymore, by the way, just the media, because that's all they are now, a transmission frequency. Breitbart showed that the media is no longer merely biased. In fact, they're no longer even ignoring the news. The mainstream media is now in the news suppression business. There are so many questions about this administration and its policies that are not being investigated because that was the job of the media prior to the election. They are so deep into this candidate that they can no longer bail, even if his numbers really crater. They criminally refuse to report what President Obama has said and voted on during his entire career, not to mention the sordid history of so many of his appointees, because as a rule, they personally agreed with it, and they knew full well that the American people would not. Would any member of the press have tolerated the kind of vacant, yawning chasm in the medical, travel, and academic records of Barack Obama had he not been the darling of liberals such as themselves? Of course not. ACORN is simply a corrupt little racket. Our republic has had ACORN-like voting scandals going back through John Kennedy, Huey Long, and Boss Tweed, Democrats all. And while they are a grave threat to our democracy, that threat has always been countered by an aggressive and free press. We as a nation have dealt with and defeated voter fraud before. What we have not ever seen before is a United States without a free press. And that's where we are today. That is the real victory won by the ACORN scandal, to show press malfeasance so great that even Jon Stewart is embarrassed to be a fake journalist. And good on you, Mr. Stewart, for having the fundamental integrity to point it out. The enemy is not ACORN. The enemy is a news media that suppresses news to favor their chosen candidate. And Andrew, Glenn Beck, and Fox News turned the ACORN fight into a canny for what was left of the press's credibility. Now, there is a dark moral to the story of Cannae that should not be forgotten. After he smashed the Romans at Cannae, Hannibal did not have the resources to continue the fight and take Rome itself. He eventually had to retreat back to Carthage. Rome regrouped. Cato the Elder did not utter a single word in the Roman Senate that did not conclude with the same sentence every time: Carthago delinda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And it was destroyed. Rome hunted down and trapped the great Hannibal, who took poison which he had carried with him for many years in a ring, just in case he was captured. Carthage was not only defeated, but the city was leveled, the ruins were burned, and salt was sown into the ground so that nothing could ever grow there again. I am now personally convinced, based on the evidence, that 90% or higher of the so-called journalists who identify themselves as liberal are determined to do just that to the conservative philosophy that is the majority opinion of most Americans: plow salt into the ground so that it can never grow again. Historically, Hannibal's victory at Cannae did not have a happy ending. So my advice to my friend Andrew Breitbart would be simply this: Andrew, keep up the attack. They're coming for you. Don't let them regroup. Summon your allies, and for God's sakes, man, keep moving. Andrew, you have drawn blood against Rome. You're in it now, my friend. Oh, and by the way, why don't you let me hold on to that ring of yours?